All right. Well, it's been about a week since I was able to record a podcast, but we have been talking about the architecture of reality. And there's a couple of reasons that things slowed down a bit. I've been doing a series summarizing the philosophies or the the three main books in Kant's philosophy, Immanuel Kant. It's over at the Substack if that's something you might be interested in, and it's just called the Critiques of Kant 1, 2, and 3. And the reason that I was doing that is because just the realization of how influential uh, Kant has been, not so much because everybody came to agree with him, but because he set the parameters of the conversations around metaphysics and and really around the way we think about epistemology, where he sort of shifted the center of the philosophical conversation in the West from metaphysics to epistemology, or it shifted in his day, and he was the one who set the parameters of the conversation. So realized that I hadn't really dug into Kant himself and tried to understand it, and so spent some time there. And but along the way, as I've been reading and studying this topic, I was reading English literature in the 16th century by C.S. Lewis, and about halfway in or so, he mentioned an author I'd never heard of, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, a Florentine, and his book, his famous oration. So, right at the end of the 1300s, the 14th century, uh, Giovanni Pico gave an oration that set the academic world on fire a little bit, and then published it a couple of years later. And C.S. Lewis mentions the shift in metaphysics that it caused, or the shift in the conversation around metaphysics, because he's the one who really argues that mankind has he has there's where he argues for a nihilistic metaphysic about mankind, that mankind doesn't really have a set nature, but that his nature can be changed. He has a changeable nature. Depending on how he acts, he can become different sorts of creatures, and how he argues uh, really for he's so humanism, which as we think of it, sort of kicks off in Florence in the Renaissance, the beginning of the Renaissance. But it's a distinctly Christian philosophy, right? It's about how Christ, in his incarnation, begins restoring us to our humanity. So that being a human is a good thing, and when Jesus became a human, that the sin is a problem in being a human. Uh, Sin is the problem, not the human nature. So our human nature is fallen, but our human nature is then restored in Christ, and the humanness of us is a good thing, but it's been bent by sin, and the unbending of the human nature is what Christ's restoration and sanctification is all about, and it's something that happens in history. So it's a very anti-Gnostic, or kind of the opposite of Gnosticism. It's the anti-Gnostic philosophy, Christian humanism. It was just called humanism because there wasn't another version of it uh, uh, being outside of the Christians. So you've got Dante, you've got Petrarch, devout Christians trying to understand, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to reflect the image of God? What is the process of the restoration of our human nature? Right? All of these questions are central to Renaissance humanism, and so you start getting the the call to go back to the sources and really understand things in their context, because there's going to be something in every human being that is reflecting the image of God, and understanding humans is in and of itself a good task, because humans reflect God. And so they knowing mankind is a means to the end of knowing God. Seeing the way mankind reflects the beauty of God is in and of itself a good thing because it's a stream through which we can swim to understand God better. And you see this is very influential in the Reformation, Protestantism, in the Catholic Restoration projects, that were also going on at the same time as Protestantism. Protestantism only ends up breaking off because there's no place for the kind of restoration project. Eventually, the restoration project is sort of rejected. The restoration of the church, the Reformation of the church is rejected, and it ends up splitting it. It's a tragedy. We shouldn't want church splits ever. But like a lot of things, God uses it. We sort of end up in something similar to maybe the time of Judges. Well, probably more like the time after the kingdom breaks apart. You end up sort of with a divided kingdom in the church, um, and we can look forward to the day that the unity is restored. But you've got to live faithfully where you're at. We're in the divided phase of the church. But that Christian humanism, what the places where you see it um, really influential are in Erasmus's attempts to restore the church, in Calvin's attempts to restore the church. Right, Calvin starts off his institutes by saying, the center of all knowledge is knowledge of God and knowledge of man. Right, that's a humanist position, a Christian humanist position. But what comes up right alongside Christian humanism is this secular humanism, where you can have the restoration of mankind, but you can do it without Jesus. You can do it without the church remaining central. You can fix and restore and put right politics without having to worry about the church. Right? You can separate the church off into its own sphere and or into its own jurisdiction and ignore it because it's a completely different jurisdiction than the political jurisdiction, which is a human jurisdiction. So you've got a divine jurisdiction and a human jurisdiction, and they don't overlap. So instead of the idea of spheres of authority, like Russian dolls of authority, where you've got one person in the middle and then you've got all of the different spheres around the outside of that one person, all of them have authority in different sorts of ways within their jurisdiction over the same person, you end up with different separate jurisdictions that don't overlap anymore in the imagination of the way they think about the organization of society. Well, that's a secular humanism that rises up. And I have always wondered, what's the root of that, right? Where does that kick off? Because you see it in full blown form by the time you get to Machiavelli, but it always looked like, well, what just sort of came out of nowhere. Does Machiavelli just invent it? Well, it turns out that uh, uh, in the same that Giovanni Pico and Machiavelli are in Florence at the same time. They overlap, and Pico writes before him and argues for this kind of secular humanism, where mankind uh, does not have a set nature. Now, and Giovanni Pico uh, argues for a kind of secular humanism. His is the kind of secular humanism that always comes in first generation secular humanism. So Christian humanism rises up, depends upon Jesus, the work of Christ on the cross. Athanasius, in his book on the Incarnation, sets the conversation of Christian humanism. I mean, really, the Old and New Testament does, but he draws on it in order to draw it into kind of the philosophical conversation. What does it look like for philosophy to come under the authority of Christ, and makes the argument. Well, and then throughout history, you see at different times Christian humanism really rise up. And you get well-educated Christianity restoring schools and education and children's education and libraries and shouting ad fontes, let's go back to the sources, understand these people, and in understanding them, come to understand ourselves and to understand God. Right? Well, secular humanism always comes out of that because it can't exist on its own. There's no good argument for secular humanism that is not just a degradation of Christian humanism. And the first generation is always a broad-minded secular humanism that says, let's take all of the sources. Let's take all of the sources. Well, all of the religions are really the same. That kind of argument. Well, that's Giovanni Pico's argument. So he uh, tries to take in Islamic philosophers and the Persians. He tries to take in all of the different religions and say they're all really teaching the same thing about the greatness of man, right? The greatness of mankind. Well, there's a sense in which the greatness of man is a Christian understanding, but it's the greatness of man in the sense that he is that Adam and Eve are the pinnacle of creation, right? Adam is created as the king of creation, and then Eve is created as his crown, right? So she is the greatest moment of creation, and created as his helper to complete the mission that God has given him. Right? So you've got that. There's a sense in which the greatness of man is a real thing, but then the fall is the twisting of the pinnacle of God's creation. So it also brings the most evil, the most destruction, and as the corporate representative, it brings the curses of God onto all of creation. And so, and a secular humanism doesn't take that into account because there's no fallen nature. Instead, it what Pico argues is that the way that we think and the way that we live keeps us down, but really we could become angels or even greater. Right? Yes. Well, and that flexibility of the nature of man that is something that the Christian humanists would have rejected or did reject. You've got a lawyer and an elder in John Calvin's church wrote against Machiavelli, right, arguing against this sort of flexible nature of mankind, that instead God establishes mankind and his limitations and his authority, and that it's all dependent upon faithfulness to God, right? That we even establish and wield authority by faith, or else it's under a curse. Well, this this new it's not a brand new idea, right? It comes from older thinkers, but he's the one who popularizes this idea that man uh, has a flexible nature that we can, by our proper use of words, by our proper use of our mind, by doing the right sorts of things, that we can elevate mankind with our own power and become something other than what we are. Well, um, this understanding of mankind, that it doesn't have a set nature, but that we have power to be whatever it is we decide to make ourselves into, uh, that is at the real heart, the real center of secular humanism. So Machiavelli, when he comes along within a generation, in that same generation, a little bit later in that generation, and starts arguing that we can make politics, we can make the nation into whatever we want, we can make the kingdom into whatever we want, because we are the masters of nature, masters of the nature of things, that if we apply the right pressure, we can change it into whatever we want. Well, that is a rejection of the older view that says we receive the spheres of authority from God. God establishes our authority, and we either wield it well or we wield it poorly, but we don't make ourselves into authority. Authority is not just about who has the most power, but it's about receiving the different jurisdictions that God gave to Adam, and then wielding them in submission to Him. So Jesus is the King of all kings. He is the high priest. He is the great prophet. All of the different jurisdictions, all of the different authorities are under Him. And when God puts us into whatever authority He puts us into, right, as a husband, as a parent, as a pastor, um, as a civic leader, whatever authority He puts us into, that our job is to say, okay, Lord, how do I reflect You in this jurisdiction and live in it well? So, um, rather than I can make this jurisdiction into whatever I want if I have the power to do it. I can form political political structures if I can get enough people on board that so uh, ideas like the social contract end up coming out of this, that that we depend upon society agreeing together, and society makes itself through agreement. Well, God is the one who establishes civic authorities. We don't make them ourselves by agreement, right? So all those different ideas come out of uh, Giovanni Pico's arguments for the flexible nature of mankind as and he even will use the term the image of God, but he switched out gods subtly. He subtly switched out which God he's talking about. And so because everybody believes we're made in the image of God, it's just an argument about which God, right? If you become an atheist, it's not long before you quit believing in people, because you believe in no God, and you end up believing in no people. People cease to have a nature; they become just animals, that sort of thing. So the God that you serve, you always end up believing that man is made in the image of whatever God you serve. So it's a so we'll talk about this more. I want to talk about how this comes into America, or when and where this comes into American culture, because it starts with a pretty distinctly Christian uh, humanist foundation, right? A Christian humanist foundation rather than a secular humanist foundation. There are secular humanists in early America, but they aren't influential the way they have come to be in places like France, where the secular humanism is the center. So, but we'll as I continue to work through some of these things, we'll keep talking